Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. The rise in poverty, decline in the provision of services, reduction in employment opportunities. These are some of the challenges that come after abrupt mine closures, with many mining companies not taking responsibilities for unsafe and unused mines. The communities living in the Sekhukhune district municipality are among those bearing the brunt of continued damage associated with mining without any benefits that come with it. I'm joined now by Mametlwe Sebei, attorney for Lawyers for Human Rights, who is in studio joining us just to get a sense of a breakdown of a report. Very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you to listeners and to viewers.
I suppose this year was quite important in highlighting, again, the very serious challenges within mining communities. And, of course, the question around government and what government will plan to do in ensuring that there is some sort of defined policy and revision on how black communities and mining communities will relate going forward. Your report, how significant is it in trying to get to the bottom of the many challenges facing the mining communities?
Well, I mean, our report comes against the background of, communities that have been calling for redress in terms of rehabilitation, in terms of, a program to tackle the crisis that is developing in communities, especially distressed by mine closures. We have been researching this problem. We released a report focused on, the Blood for Aid gold mine that closed in 2013, and now this report extrapolates that problem, necessarily because we realize that it's not limited on Carltonville. Now, the funding that we've made, of course, do vindicate what many communities have been raising, and there are many affected community civic groups that have been saying that there is no plan here to address a terrible legacy of mine closures in this country. Communities that are facing mine closures are in distress environmentally, socially, and economically, and nothing is being done to hold mine companies responsible for that accountable.
What are some of the really key questions that you were trying to get to the bottom of in this report as you try and find some sort of way forward?
Well, we, assess the situation from many perspectives, environmental, social, and economic, because if mining development is justified as an alternative to other forms of development on the basis that it will bring about an upliftment of communities, we have got to ask, at the end of the lifespan of the mine, how is that community in comparison to where it was, in comparison to where it would be had other, forms of economic development and land use being in place. And what we are finding is that, by all measures, mining in this country is a disaster to many, particularly black working class communities. Just in terms of environment, Gauteng alone, you have about 500 kilometers of mine dumps that are poorly maintained and rehabilitated, and those mine dumps contain about 600,000 tons of chemically toxic and radioactive uranium material. The result of that is a situation, for instance, in Soweto, where this whole organization of, one of our clients, which, parents of children that are born with cerebral palsy,
Yes.
And, they can't move their limbs, their legs, their lives are actually shattered, but so are those of, women in these communities that are caring for them. But also we found that, in terms of levels of employment, because these economies in these communities never diversify, what you do find out is that when the mine closes, it means a loss of employment for the vast majority of the people that are dependent on the mine for employment, but also small businesses that depend on those people that are earning income from the mine. And there's absolutely nothing been done from the side of these corporations, from the side of the mines, to ensure a sustainable post-mining communities, but also to ensure that workers are both skilled, but also economies and local communities are actually prepared in terms of skills, but also in terms of investment, to ensure that these communities are able to sustain themselves beyond mine.
And we saw the dangers of it, I suppose, a lot of this year when we saw communities in different parts, in different provinces of the country, speaking to their cries. I mean, the socio-economic impact is imperative, but there comes elements of criminality. Illegal mining, where is it placed, and how will a proper structure then allow for some socio-economic benefit for the community?
Absolutely. And, you know, what we have seen in Krugersdorp is actually merely a tip of an iceberg. There's over 6,000 mines in this country that are abandoned and derelict, meaning ownerless, without closure certificates. And, you know, the mining industry will tell us that that is because of, you know, the previous legal framework that did not make provision for a proper closure and closure certificates. But the reality is that our research are finding that the situation is getting worse. Just between 2011 and 2016, the department issued about 803 mine closure certificates. Mm-hmm. Of those, over 83%, actually, about 83% of them, you know, they were for small, you know, permits which apply for a short-term, small-scale mining. They are for prospecting and so forth. Of those that remain, I think only about 27 are actually mining right. And of that, there is almost none in Limpopo, in Gauteng, in Free State, the provinces that are hosting core minerals for which industrial mining is taking place in this country. Mm. So it means, even with the existing legal framework, the situation is getting worse. And what we have seen in Krugersdorp, unfortunately, is a reality, a brutal reality that is a daily experience of many people living in these communities where there is a reign of terror, because when mine abandon the mine workers, not only does it abandon these mine workers, it also abandons improperly closed mines with open pits that then allow, you know, an organized criminal syndicates to move in, often taking advantage of the fact that some of these mines with the skills, but also the knowledge of the underground operations of the mine, are unemployed, are disparate, but also have no access to capital as well as the markets to be able to sell some of the products that they then continue to mine without license, of course, on the basis of artisanal mining. Mm. But the main point is that a major illegality in this country is committed by big corporations that are licensed, because once we are not complying with your environmental management programs, once we are not complying with their social and labor plans, because the non-compliance of social and labor plans is the reason that we have high levels of unemployment in this community, a disastrous housing situation, but also a pressures in terms of public infrastructure that does not cope with a surplus population that is suddenly created by improper mine closure. And these are things for which there is a need for strategy. These are things for which we are saying that communities must begin to mobilize in. In Skukune, where we're going to be doing this report, a lot of mines there are under care and maintenance. Bukoni mines, which also employ over 10,000 people. Yeah. There is mine called Blue Ridge. There is mine actually that has been under care and maintenance since 1996. That mine, the land is sterilized. That mine is continuing to cause pollution, but that mine yields absolutely no benefit for community in terms of jobs and any form of, plowing back in development of that community. So
with this impending crisis, I mean, where lies the accountability? I mean, who is the elephant in the room here?
And this part of the problem, you know, people speak about the state capture in this country. But the reality is, you know, what people are talking about is just petty criminality of, you know, some of the politicians in the ANC and other things and so on. What we're not speaking about is the state formation in this country that, you know, means that basically you can say all the way since the Anglo-Boer War, the creation of the union in this country, South African state has primarily been a mining capitalist state in a sense. Its policies, its program, its model of development has always been centered around advancement of the interests of the mining industry. And, you know, to think that there will be any accountability, particularly of this section of the capitalist class in this country, is illusion on the basis of the whole structure of the economy, but also the relationship between this section of capital and particularly the political elite in this country. The reality is, as I've said, the problem is getting worse, right? We are seeing, even in the context of many mines that have been closed, often in a form of, you know, care and maintenance plans, which are supposed, in a case, for instance, of Twickenham, they said, no, it will only be closed for about, 3-4 years, will be back into operations and so on. And people handed these cooperations their land, hoping that it's going to give their children jobs and other things and so on. In Blue Ridge Mine, they've been saying, well, we're going to sell this mine in the next coming 2-3 years and so on. Nothing has happened. 10 years, over 10 years on the line, that community is sitting with land dispossessions for which they have not been redressed. At the same time, there are no jobs that they can be able to show for it. Now, what is the solution? The solution, ultimately, we think, would be the mining communities beginning to say, how do we build campaign? One, to demand release of tens of billions of rands that are somewhere in what they call financial provisioning to ensure that this money goes towards rehabilitations of some of these abandoned mines and abandoned mine dumps that are causing a major public health disaster in these areas. Yeah. But also, how do we make sure that these mining companies, many of which are still here, that are serial offenders in terms of abandoning of these mines, are held to account, and they make the necessary capital investment, both in terms of rehabilitation, but in terms also of economic rehabilitations of these communities. Because, once you take a community from agricultural subsistence farming community into a mining, and you transform that into a mining town, there's no going back. The reality is, many people seeking jobs flux in that area and so on. That changes the whole structure of the community. How do you ensure that then there's housing to be able to avoid the informal settlements that are developing in these areas and so on? How do you ensure that there is enough jobs? How do we diversify economy to ensure that those that are not employed in the mines are able to get the jobs and so on? Mm-hmm. How do you ensure that there is development, but also there is sufficient financial provision to ensure adequate rehabilitation at closure, but also adequate, transition, or rather a just transition to a sustainable post-mining economy and post-mining, communities.
Yeah. So you've submitted and broken down the elements that you speak of within this report. What happens now?
Well, we have been in conversation with the department since the national launch of this report in Carltonville about a month ago. Mm-hmm. We are going to, and I think they said they want to share with us some of their perspective, but also even before this mine closure report launch, we have shared our findings with the department, mm-hmm. and I think we made input into their current draft of national strategy on mine closures. And that strategy do have promising elements. But the reality is, we know, unless communities organize, mobilize, but also campaign for cooperate and state accountability, nothing much is going to happen. Yeah. That draft strategy on mine closures begin to speak to issues that we've been raising of diversification of local mining communities and their economies. It speaks to the issue of integrated plans to ensure not just rehabilitations, but also economic development of those areas and so on. Because we have a ridiculous situation, for instance, in Skukuno, where there are many mines which in any other situation they will actually be supporting a development of a major city. Mm. Nothing, absolutely nothing by way of that development. But more than that, everyone is just competing to build, useless stadia that not only are they of no use to those communities, but in many ways they become white elephants that drain the resources of local municipalities that are trying to maintain them. On the other hand, people are bringing, they are building infrastructure that becomes of absolutely no use. Where there is housing, that housing is not integrated into a local housing plans, and when the mine closes, many of the workers abandon those houses, chasing, new opportunities for things and so on. And this was evident in Rustenburg, where you have, informal, settlement with shacks in horrendous living conditions, if you like, next to a mine where there is, hundreds of rooms that, are of quality, which, however, have been abandoned, and now they are being vandalized by Zamazamas seeking to eke what living they can out of what scrap metal they can be able to have. If that housing was part of the local housing development program, all that you had to do was for that community to move into those housing. You would have resolved the issue of that squatter camp. But at the same time, you would have made sure that these houses, which not only are they being vandalized, but in many ways also becomes safe havens for all these criminal elements in these areas that particularly move in with the mine closure, that's not happen. So these are some of the areas, but at the end of the day, central to the resolution of the crisis in the mining communities is going to be communities, mining-affected communities, is going to be communities themselves on the basis of their own organization, on the basis of their own struggles, and on the basis of their own program.
So what are the demographics? I mean, if you speak about communities that need to be active, I mean, looking at Sekhukhune, you speak about the migration, people looking, younger people looking, going outside to look for better opportunities. Is there the capacity for that energized fight to ensure that, there is justice being served?
Well, we are working on that, but I mean, communities have been fighting. It's not like they've been waiting for this report and other things. I mean, the situation in the mining communities, particularly in a black mining, affected communities, has been that of the permanent state of revolt and rebellion, which even the Chamber of Mines actually acknowledged. What I think we have been lacking is an organization that can be able to coordinate, to organize and make sure that we unite these communities into an organized mass movement that can, of course, be felt in the same way, of course, that the organized mining industry is able to exert pressure on this government. Now, there has been important steps on that. Today we have, Makua, which is a mining-affected communities united in action, is the biggest in the sector, but also there are others like Matchcon, and of course at local level, the community that we're actually handling this launch with is called Sekhukhune Combined Mining Communities Affected. Mining affected communities. Now, and they have been campaigning at local level. I mean, at the beginning of this year, there's been demand from this community for Anglo Platinum to reopen the mine. That they've actually placed under care and maintenance. There's been similar movement to demand accountability of Anglo, but now Motsipe in case of Bokone mine, but also the community at Blue Ridge went so far as to state sit in to occupy that mine and to demand that what must happen there is an application by government of use it or lose it. If the mining corporations cannot find a meaningful and productive use for that mine, they must give it to the community. And the community should be able then to continue mining and provide jobs in those communities and so on. These are conversations that tomorrow we are going to be having. More than that, we're also going to be saying what then becomes a strategy to build a movement in Sekhukhune, to build a movement that can be able to force accountability, including, by the way, we will not shy to say that these communities will be discussing a program of role mass actions in those particular areas because ultimately it's only on that basis that we see progress but also accountability of these big mining corporations.
Yeah, very well. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming in studio and talking to us about this very important topic. Mametlwe Sebei, attorney for Lawyers for Human Rights, is speaking about the very important aspect of mining, the way forward of the drafting a report that speaks to many questions, questioning the political power and the influence of mining communities, as well as trying to chart a way forward.